Hi everybody, welcome to Living La Vita Loca podcast. My name is Faz, and that bleak, dark silence is usually where Rich speaks, but Rich isn't here. Rich is at home with COVID and not well, bless him. So I'm just talking to the microphone by myself, which I find very weird. You talk all the time on the podcast, but not having a person sat beside you is a bit odd. So anyway, we're going to try and do a podcast this week, and we hope it's still high quality bants, but I'm not sure it will be. We'll see. You'll just have to deal with it for a week. Rich can't be here. He has done some work for the podcast, and he has done a segment, which is great. You just won't get the bouncing that you get off each other all the time, which is just a laugh a minute. The first sort of section that you'll hear is Rich, and this week we're going to be looking at Need for Speed Most Wanted on the PS Vita from 2012, and I'll be looking at Burnout Legends from 2005 on the PSP. Both games are produced by Criterion Studios. The first game, the Burnout Legends, chronologically, is one of a few of the games that Criterion produced in the Burnout franchise. And then the Most Wanted game is actually a remake, kind of the 2005 game made by EA. I think it's Black Box Studios. So Criterion actually moved away from Burnout and onto Need for Speed as a franchise, and they've done quite a few Need for Speed games since then. So it's just interesting to see how that kind of transition happened. We're going to be doing this in a bit of a weird way, kind of a bit like a letters sort of situation. We're going to be sending letters to each other. I can't, for whatever reason, get out of my head Letters to You by Finch from the early 2000s. I'm writing again, these letters to you, and that the rest of that song. So we're going to see how it works. It's only for this week and next week's podcast, just in terms of, I guess, the content really. So stick with it. Hope it's not terrible. Just quick plug. I mean, if anybody listens to this podcast and lives in the local area over the next 2 days and still wants to come down to our FIFA tournament, it'll be our first collaboration with Horsforth Brewery. That's happening this Wednesday, the 6th of September. I'll get it right this time. At 7 p.m. down at Horsforth Brewery in Horsforth, funnily enough. And so if you feel like you want to come and get involved in that, it's great. It's the first Wednesday of every month, our gaming night down there. So if you can't get involved in this one, don't worry about it. If you're not interested, totally get that. There'll be more different variety as we go on and as we start to develop that. So anyway, so the very first thing you're going to hear is Rich's review of Need for Speed Most Wanted for the PS Vita. A reminder, Rich is pretty ill, so, he sounds like shit. What's new? What's new? So, anyway, I'm going to hand it over to Rich, and then I, luckily, at the end of it, get a little bit of a bounce back, because then I can actually have all my own opinions, and Rich can't say a single damn thing about it, or maybe a couple of bits. Cool, speak to you soon.
Hello, so I'm quite ill at the moment, so we're trying to work out how to tackle this, and I've got to give all credit for the idea for doing these little separate segments to our friend Paddy from the 15 Minute Swiss Football podcast, because I figured, it's okay for me to just sit here and talk at you for a couple of minutes. Also, this way I can edit out any coughing fits or anything like that. So I've been playing Need for Speed Most Wanted on the Vita. What year was this? 2012. Oh, my box is in Spanish, and I've never noticed that. Oh, that's exciting. So it's published by EA, but crucially, as far as I'm concerned, made by Criterion, and they did a lot of the Burnout games back in the day. I really, really enjoyed the Burnout series, like Burnout 2, Burnout 3, and Burnout on the PSP was probably a high point for me. I think it was Burnout Legends, but spent a lot of time with it. And well, let me go back a step. Need for Speed, I've dabbled with I used to have a Need for Speed Hot Pursuit on the PC, like, I don't know, it must have been late 90s or something like that. And, with the benefit of hindsight, it was probably the kind of era where it looked like it was a couple of cardboard boxes just scooting around a rug. But, had some fun with it. It was definitely Need for Speed Underground and Underground 2 that kind of grabbed me a bit more. And yeah, I've got kind of dipped in and out of it. So for Criterion to have a crack at Need for Speed is interesting, but I do feel like something's been lost in the jump. So it's kind of open world. You go around and you can find various events to take part in, different types of races and things like that. And occasionally you'll get into chases with the cops and things like that. And like none of it is as do I want to say like none of it's as exciting, dare I say it, as something that's built around that as a mechanic. And I know it sounds stupid for a game called Most Wanted, but like racing is front and center. Whereas you go to something like Grand Theft Auto or Driver, I guess, where the chases are king, and it shows. So here it's kind of feels like window dressing, weirdly. In fact, window dressing is probably quite a good way of viewing this whole thing, because like it's on paper it's all there. It's an open city. There's traffic. There's cars you can switch between. Once you've found an event or a car, you can switch to it at will. You only have to travel to it once and all that kind of stuff. But there's not much traffic. The city's quite sparse. It's all a little bland. Like that sounds really harsh, because the fact that they've managed to squeeze this game onto a handheld device, like you can't fault the technical achievement. Like it is impressive that they've done it, but it's at what cost? and so it sort of feels sort of open world. It sort of feels like a racing game. It sort of feels like a chase game. It's got licensed cars, so yes, there are crashes, but they crash like they're toy cars. Like there's none of the Burnout style. You get the time penalty, but at the same time, if you're of a certain disposition, you could probably take the crashes as a reward. Certainly, they could use crashes as the cornerstone of entire game modes in Burnout. There's none of that here. So it feels like one hand is tied behind its back by the licensing. But it does the job. It's is it fun? Is it exciting? I'm sitting here thinking like, I mean, I guess on one hand, yeah, maybe, but I've been ill, so I've not really had the reflexes for it. So I guess on some level, it's quick. But if we're talking arcade fun, I'd be going for one of the Burnout games or Wipeout or Ridge Racer instead. I think this wouldn't be topping my list by any stretch. And I mean, I'm just looking at a note I've got here about the soundtrack. Like, it's got Muse in it. Butterflies and Hurricanes, and that's a suitably intense and in equal measure kind of classical baroque kind of ostentatious piece of music. But the rest of the soundtrack just doesn't seem to hit the same high point. A lot of stock got put into the first couple of minutes, the intro and how it all strings together, and then after that it just kind of feels like it loses its way a little bit and becomes a bit of a collectathon, and you work your way up the most wanted ranks and things like that. But it feels like you're just ticking things off a list, for better or worse. And you have to. In fact, one example of this would be to get any upgrades on your car, you have to do the races. So you have to win a race or get a certain rank in a race, unlock the upgrade, and then pay for it with the Need for Speed fun bucks you earn from being a naughty person, and speeding past cameras and all that kind of stuff. But it does mean that if you get to a certain race, and you feel like you need to upgrade your car, you need to go back to it and kind of grind for it. Or, you know, you could just drive around a bit more and just find a better car, switch to that, and then go and at least stand a better chance. So it does feel like this kind of notion of progression is fighting against this kind of need for balance. Need for Balance would have been a much worse name for the game. But, you know, it's all exciting enough, I guess. I mean, that sounds really lame. But, you know, it's fine. It's a solid 6 out of 10. There are some audio glitches, but you can't fault the fact that it's all on there. But it all feels a bit, I don't know, characterless, featureless. I mean, you compare it to something like Burnout Paradise, and it's like night and day. But that said, I'd struggle to name anything else like it on the Vita. So, yeah, if you're into this sort of thing, you could definitely get some fun out of it. But otherwise, I think you'd definitely be better off with the Wipeouts of the world. Yeah, 6 out of 10, I think. So, you might have noticed that I was tailing off a bit there. I've, you know, had a cup of tea and a bit of a think, and I've worked out what was bugging me, right, about that review snippet I just did. And I stand by all of it. You know, this isn't going to be oh no, like we'll delete the whole thing and start again. Because I've been ill, right, all I've been wanting to do is sit around watching old wrestling videos, right? You know, the just stuff I can find on YouTube and all that kind of stuff. It's bright, it's colourful, I don't have to think, and occasionally it's quite impressive. Like, you know, that's the level I'm at. So, actually, for the last, you know, week or so, the most fun I've had with this game hasn't been the racing, hasn't been the chasing, it hasn't been any of the flashy stuff that you're actually there for with the game. It's the fact that it is that nearly open world. The most fun I've had with it is just pootling around, exploring and finding new cars, right? And just, you know, that pleasant moment of, you know, finding yourself on the arse end of an industrial estate, going around the corner and being like, oh, hey, that looks shiny, and going and seeing what it is. And I think there is something weirdly entertaining in that, and I've got to give it credit for that. And I think it would be remiss of me to put this out without calling that out, because I do genuinely think that, you know, it's almost like automobile Pokemon. You know, like, and there is something to be said for just going and collecting them all. And I have found some good fun in that. But, you know, to go to my previous point about balance and things like that, it does feel like it kind of upsets things a little bit. So at one point, I was driving around and I think I found like a little Subaru hatchback thing that, you know, for the race I was up against, you took one look at it and like, well, I'd need to go and grind a load of races out to make that viable. But by the time you kind of accelerated away from where you started, realised that it's probably not going to be able to get off the line quick enough for what you need it for, you're on the other side of the car park, and lo and behold, there's a Lamborghini. You're like, oh, well, yeah, sure, I'll just use that. I won't even bother, like, grinding to make the other car better. Like, there's no real incentive to try that unless you happen to be a fan of that particular car and you want to make it viable. So, like, it's nice that there's an option there, but at the same time, it feels like everything's kind of weirdly disposable, I think, is probably a good way of putting it. And I think that was the point that was eluding me before, was that it just feels like you have this really high turnover of cars if you're trying to take the game seriously. If you're just pootling around to tick them off a list and just, you know, the sheer excitement of, you know, oh, what am I going to discover next? You know, it's a different story. But I do think it's an important point. And I mean, I may well have missed something with how a lot of this strings together, because full disclosure, it remembered my old save from when I last played this. It must have been about, I don't know, 2016 or something like that. So I was kind of halfway up the most wanted list, but also restarting the game. So some events were checked off, other ones weren't. So like, I do wonder if some of my qualms about balance and progression are tied into the fact that my save was somehow upsetting the game. So one to bear in mind, but it doesn't change my score. It's still a solid 6 out of 10. It's still a good recommendation if you're into this sort of thing. Is it as good as any of the Burnout games? I would dispute that, but I have a real soft spot for Burnout anyway. But yeah, there is still very much fun to be had with this.
Thanks for that, Rich. We really appreciate you fighting through a hard illness to provide us with a really important review of the game from 11 years ago on a small handheld device. It feels like it's, it was really vital that we got that in there. So I'm sorry I'm making you work. Anyway, yeah. So feedback on that then. My letter back to you. A couple of things. Need for Speed Balance. It's not a horrible name. So remembering Civil War, Marvel Civil War from 2015, where Bucky Barnes has a code read out to him by Hydra Soldier that activates him as the Winter Soldier. So what I want to do is I want to read you the names of the other Need for Speed games in the series, and I think this will probably activate somebody somewhere, because it sounds like the same sort of thing, where actually the names are a bit just blah, but they all make sense from a racing point of view and a racing game point of view, an arcade racer certainly, of the type that Need for Speed are, but also, just they're okay. I'll read it in, obviously, a Russian voice, because for some reason all Hydra agents were Russian or Nazis. I don't really, Anyway, Hot Pursuit, High Stakes, that went Scottish there, Unleashed, Underground, Carbon, I can't carry that on, Pro Street, Underground, Undercover, Shift, Nitro, World, The Run, Most Wanted, Rivals, No Limits, Payback, Heat, Unbound. That actually ended up sounding a lot like the shipping forecast here in the UK, but what would be great would be if the areas on the shipping forecast were actually those names from Need for Speed. In fact, they need to literally trade those off, so you end up with, I don't know, Need for Speed Dogger, and then you end up with Unbound being a place in the shipping forecast. Just a personal preference of mine. Also, just wanted to say as well, it's interesting that Most Wanted, so it's produced by Black Box Studios in 2005, which was an EA studio. Man, how many studios have EA acquired over the years? When I was just researching into Need for Speed and Burnout, so many that have just kind of been enveloped by EA, and I get that we're always on at EA, and I'm going to try and spin this positively, I think, really, because even though they are a behemoth, I'm hoping at least then that they protected these studios and allowed them to produce series like these in their own vein. And it seems that actually, if you do look at how these studios kind of started off, and they were in the middle of designing these sort of mid-2000 games, Most Wanted, for example, and the Burnout games that Criterion produced, it looks like they were able to kind of carry on those same vibes of games, and it looks like EA just spotted something and were like, we can make money from this, and you can carry on doing what you're doing. And it might even worked quite well for licensing, so music, which I know Rich touched upon on his review, and also I'll touch upon in my review as well. It's just interesting to think that actually, was it a positive maybe that it was picked up by EA and Black Box Studios, and the same for Criterion, or it could be a negative. It could be that actually maybe that's what made the games bland, and they might have a different direction coming out of each of the games. It's hard to say, but I just thought it was a really interesting point to talk about that, and I'm sure it's something we'll touch upon in future podcasts again and again about EA and their influence on the business and how big they are and how much people kind of deride them, but actually is all of their influence positive or negative, even though most people talk about being negative. Anyway, so Most Wanted, it was was produced back in 2005, the console versions were really well received, and actually, when I looked into it, it regularly sits in the top 3 of most games on Need for Speed games lists online. So it was interesting to hear from Rich that actually it doesn't sound like the remake from Criterion was actually all that. I know that Need for Speed Most Wanted 510 came out on the PSP the same day that Need for Speed Most Wanted on the PS2 and other consoles came out at the same time. And as far as I was aware, it was the same game, except it wasn't. So it was missing a story and it's missing cutscenes. I actually have the game in my house. Am I going to play it? Maybe not. And the reason is because actually there's 2 other Need for Speeds came out on the PSP that I'm probably a bit more interested in after obviously hearing Rich's review. Maybe I don't need to go back to Most Wanted. And there was Pro Street and Carbon came out on the PSP. So that brings me on to the last point, really, that came out of that when I was thinking about what Rich was saying. How well catered for was the arcade racer on PSP? I'm the one coughing. Excuse me. Wipeout, Ridge Racer, Need for Speed, Burnout, Outrun. So many ridiculous amounts of these games were made for the PSP, and from what I've experienced so far, obviously we've already had this conversation on the podcast way back when about when we talk about arcade races. That most of them are pretty good. They seem like pretty good ports of the main games that are over on console, and also they seem like, you know, that they hold up quite well on a handheld. So that got me thinking: is there something to porting a racing game over to a handheld? It's probably actually that is the game an easier type of game to be able to port over. I guess it probably is. You don't need much of a storyline to a racing game. Usually, I wouldn't think, to enjoy it. So, yeah, you know, that's just an interesting point that I'd say that, you know, it seems to be a really good area for racing games to live in on the PSP and PS Vita. So, with that in mind, then, I'm going to talk about my review, which is Burnout Legends. So, Rich touched on this in his podcast. He hasn't got his own podcast. In his part of the podcast, and he said that he has extremely fond memories of the Burnout series and also this game in particular. I do too, or at least I did until I played it again, and that made me change my opinion on it a little bit, and on the series a little bit as well. And I'll get to that in a minute. But yeah, so it was released in 2005, so it was the launch title for the PSP, and it was released at the same time as Burnout Revenge on home consoles, but it's not a port of that game. It's actually a bit of a mix of I think it's given me COVID through the podcast. I don't know how that's happened. It's actually a remix of the first 3 Burnout games, but it's probably closest to Burnout 3. So Burnout 3 was Burnout Takedown, another one of those classic names for these game series. But at least that one's quite relevant. And Burnout 3, Takedown, and then Revenge were both PSP, PS2 games even. And then you had this on the PSP. You got Burnout Dominator later on the PSP as well. And then you end up with Burnout Paradise. And Burnout Paradise is the biggest departure in the series as it becomes that open world feel. There's a lot of people, when you look back at Burnout Paradise, are a bit derogatory about it because they said it was trying to be a bit too Grand Theft Auto-y. But I think that from what Rich was saying in his review, that's kind of like, there's also a bit of fun in that. And I remember that in Burnout Paradise being that you could, and I can see why they gave that a remake, and it was very popular at the time as well, because you did get that little bit of time between races and takedown races and things where you could just go and knock about and find all the signs you could knock down, for example, and do all the fun jumps and see how far you could get on jumps. So I think it's a bit weird, really, that people are a bit like, well, that's not really kind of like Burnout of Burnout 3 and Revenge and Legends sort of style. When actually, I think you had all that in Burnout Paradise and more, and I don't think it was a bad thing that you had a little bit more. So I find it really interesting that people don't have Paradise as high as me and Rich probably have it in terms of the thought process around the Burnout series. And I'd probably have it, I'd say number 1, I think, really, just because of the amount that it offers and amount of fun you can have on that game, and it really is quite an expansive game. It lasts a long while, which is, you don't say that for all arcade races. So I think that if we want to talk a little bit about Burnout Legends then in a bit more detail, in terms of, I guess, compared to Burnout Paradise then, which came a couple of years later, Burnout Paradise was that expansive sort of iteration. This wasn't. This felt very bare bones, if you will. There was a lot of the same thing in this game. So the types of modes, there's a race mode, which is you race against 3 other people. So they couldn't even get more than 3 other races on the PSP. You'd at least want 4 or 5. I think on Burnout 3 you raced against 6. It was against 5 other people. So that was a bit disappointing. That actually didn't feel as competitive as you want it to be. There's a time tap mode, which is just your quick lap, which frankly they're quite fun little challenges, but also could get a little bit boring. And this is all done on a world tour mode, where basically you've got lots of different events and you have to get a certain number of golds to continue onwards. Gold medals, that is. So road rage, that's a set number of takedowns, and that's probably, I think, the key part of a Burnout game compared to other games as arcade races is the fun of takedowns. The whole mechanic that you add into a race by putting that in there, it just completely changes Burnout as a series compared to other arcade races, and that's probably, I think, that's its unique selling point, really. If you took that out of Burnout, it would just be a formulaic racer, and I think as the first game probably was, the very first Burnout. So I think that, yeah, it's really important they're in there, and they're vital to winning races in this mode as well, because actually it vastly improves the amount of boost that you get. So if you do a takedown, you get more boost added to your boost meter. So even in the modes like a race mode where you don't need to be doing takedowns to actually win the race, you kind of do. So it almost means that you kind of hang around the other competitors a bit more. It's a bit more of a race because you want to take them down. So it does add in more competition and does make it a hell of a lot more fun than just owning a race outright and just racing ahead and being 10 seconds ahead, because actually what's the point in that? You're just doing a burning lap effectively all the way around. Other little modes, Crash. So we'll get onto Crash in a minute, because that is, I guess, another unique selling point of Burnout. But that is where you earn cash in the biggest crash. Eliminator is a last car standing per lap. So that's quite fun, because obviously you have 4 laps and the slowest car gets eliminated every single time. So you end up with 1 car left at the end, which is probably a more fun way of doing the race. And actually, I don't know why I bother having races anymore when you could have that. And then Face Off, that's a race against a rival only over 3 laps. That is the most pointless mode I've ever come across. Just 1 car that you've got to take down like 6 or 7 times, and that's how you collect that car. But it's just boring. It's just really boring. There's 5 different classes of cars to unlock in World Tour mode. You start with 1 class, which I think is the muscle class, and you unlock cars by building up points or building up amounts of takedowns during events. The cars are all just generic, as Rich put it before, kind of boxes on carpets, if I'm going to be honest. Like, it doesn't look amazing, this game. It looks okay, but the cars, I'm guessing one of the points in Need for Speed that were better than Burnout would be that the cars will look better, and you kind of get those more licensed looking cars that are a bit more slick. And I think that might even be a reason why Burnout was possibly left a little bit in the lurch, and Criterion and EA went in the direction of Need for Speed, because you probably got more people interested in that, especially people who are interested in cars were probably more likely to be involved in a Need for Speed game and have fun with that. And I think they probably thought this is a perfect mix of both of them in terms of Burnout and Need for Speed. That's how they carried on the series with Criterion within the EA capacity. Anyway, back to this game. So one thing I wanted to get to then was the Crash mode. It is so much fun. The Crash mode is the antithesis of the face-off mode. I just can't help but think that, you just drive into the middle of a crossroads and smash up as many vehicles as you want, and it feels great. It is so therapeutic to do that. And there's obviously a little bit of tactics to it as well. There's little boosts you can catch on the way in. There's little cash things, little cash sort of icons you can catch on the way in as well, because you have to try and get a certain amount of cash to get a medal. Where you hit the crossroads, what you hit, it can be random, it can be complete chance with what turns up or what gets computer generated, but also it can be really tactical in terms of you hit a bus or you hit a fuel tanker. They're the things you want to be aiming for. And I can't help but feel, sorry for some of the people involved in these things. Geoff, he's on his daily commute to the forest commissionary, the forestry commission even, sorry. He's got 3 kids. He's got a dog in a wheelchair. He's got no idea what's about to happen to him. I'm just there, ploughing into him, ending everything, his whole existence, his family, and, I just don't care. I'm just in it for the money. And that part's probably not that fun, but it's kind of fun. The graphics in this game, as I alluded to before, they do drop out regularly when you're going at top speed. So when you're ploughing into said Geoff and destroying his world, if you're doing it too quickly, the graphics can take a little while to catch up. So if you're boosting completely around a corner in a race, it can just drop out around the corner and then it'll drop back in, and all you can kind of see really is the car and the road just immediately ahead of you, which for a 2005 game, it's kind of acceptable, but also kind of not. So I think that I will dock points from this game because of that. Other things I want to say about this game, a couple of good things, a couple of bad things. The soundtrack, again, Rich spoke about the soundtrack on his game, Need for Speed Most Wanted, and how that has that classic EA, they try and keep their music relevant to their crowd, and that's very much like this game. I would consider Burnout series to be a little bit like a chaotic racer, and probably a bit indie, a little bit grimy, and you get the feel of the bands that are on this. We Are Scientists, Billy Talent, Goldfinger, Yellow Card. Take me back to episode 12 when we were at Slam Dunk. That's exactly the kind of bands that are on there. So, the music's great. The only problem is I think there's only about 12 tracks, and it's just not enough songs. So you can flip between songs while you're racing, which is really good, because if you want to get to a specific song that you love, that's great. And obviously with the limited number of buttons on the PSP, that's really good that you can do that. It is on the select button though, which is right at the bottom of the screen, and that's quite hard to do whilst you're racing with the PSP. Another thing, it feels like there's really quite a lot going on here. So Rich alluded to there being quite a bit of a collector-thon on Need for Speed Most Wanted. And I'm sorry, Rich, but I know this is why I was saying you remember looking at Burnout or rose-tinted glasses. You look at this game, it couldn't be more of a collectathon. There's medals, trophies, points, records, cars, events. They are all things that you can collect in this game. It's just too much. I don't know why you don't have just 1 or 2 things that you would collect. It just feels like they are really trying to suck as much value out of a smallish game by making you gain all these things. And yeah, again, I just feel like I remembered it being really fun, but actually there's a lot of things now as a 35-year-old man ago. Do I really need to be worried about what I'm collecting here? Probably not. I just need to be enjoying the gameplay. I think is the gameplay and maps enough. It is, it's there's brilliant stuff as well. The rolling starts after a crash, they're just game changing in terms of keeping you going in the game. You can have a massive takedown go wrong or a massive crash go wrong whilst you're in a race, and you get a rolling start back to where you were. It just gets you back into the action straight away. So well done Burnout for keeping that as a mechanic, because it really helps. I mentioned the competition with the AI before. The AI, they're a set of shits. They're an absolute set of bastards, and I don't mind that. I love that they're up in my face. That it's great because it means that you really get that lovely feeling of revenge when you take somebody out and you just give them a little clip, and it's probably Geoff's brother Pedro who's come back for revenge, and actually you're going to go take him out, and you'll feel pretty good about that as well. And the breakneck speed, that's always been the key to Burnout. If you're playing Burnout and you're not holding down the boost button at all times, then you're not really playing Burnout. So you get that real sense of excitement and speed in those crashes as you go around corners. So, yeah, all in all, I'd give this game a 7 out of 10. I kind of picked it a little bit, and I picked at the franchise a little bit to say there's things there that aren't wonderful. But it does give you enough joy to think back, actually, and think Burnout as a franchise, especially around sort of 3, Revenge, this game, and Paradise, was really a fantastic sort of entity, and you could play it for hours, and you can't say that very often about an arcade racer. I go back to my Ridge Racer review, and I said that I really love Ridge Racer, but I kind of done it in a couple of hours, and I didn't feel like I needed to go back to it, whereas this, I feel like you could go back to it quite a lot. Maybe not this iteration of Legends as much as, say, I'm thinking about Paradise, but there's enough in this as well to say, actually, it's a lot of fun for a few days. And, if you want to have a funeral for Geoff and his family, go ahead. But I don't care, all right? Things happened, cars were crashed, things were said, and I still feel like I come out on top like a champion. So, that's me done with this game. Peace out.
I feel like we need to have a moment's silence for your man Geoff. So I was toying with recording this bit outside, but my neighbour's radio was on, so that moment's silence would have been punctuated by the guitar solo from I Want to Break Free, which, read into that what you will. I also nearly started this with, Dear Faz, imagine my surprise reading about your escapades driving very fast in a virtual world. And then I thought, it's just twee. So here we are. The other bit that, Faz has been mulling over, and he did run it by me, and I've, had a vague answer, but I'd be lying if I said I gave it much thought, was about like perfect gaming ages, and is there one? I guess. I think like my sort of late teens were probably ideal for having the time to do it, but I think now is ideal for me with like actually being able to afford it and fund it through my own ways and means, and treat it as a hobby a little bit more, and like collect and stuff like that. I guess technically the perfect age would be, the as long as you're the minimum age of the rating on the box, then it doesn't really matter, right? And even then, I guess a lot of people are going to be flexible about that. But, well, I guess it works both ways as well. For every, back in the day, there'd be parents, trying to buy Grand Theft Auto for 8-year-olds. And for every person like that, I guess nowadays you've got somebody who, complains about Pokemon being dumbed down, and they're well in their 30s and have been playing it since day dot. And, Pokemon's for idiots nowadays, and they just don't realise that it's actually still aimed at children. Just, they know a few more older people play it, so, fair play, but they're not the main audience, and said audience are at risk of becoming entitled arseholes. But yeah, it's ultimately, I don't think there's a perfect age. Like I might be able to afford things a bit more nowadays, but I don't have the time to play a lot of it like I did when I had the time. I didn't have the money, so there's always going to be a balance to strike. But yeah, that's a bad answer, isn't it? So yeah, enjoy that.
Funnily enough, I have come out of my garden, although I think I've been bitten by something pretty aggressively. Got a pretty big red mark on my ankle. So, this never would have happened at your house, Rich. Sunset the cat doesn't bite, usually. So, that's one thing that's happened from this that's been worse than usual. The reason that I'd kind of thought about what the perfect age is to game is probably was brought on by nostalgia from playing Burnout Legends, because it feels like to me that 16 to 18 years old felt like the perfect gaming age for me, and there's a few reasons behind that, and one of them was almost the opposite of what you were saying, Rich, was that actually I probably had more disposable income when I was 16 to 18 from working as a manager at McDonald's than I do now, if I'm going to be honest, because I wasn't paying any rent or anything, hadn't gone to university yet. You know, drinks in nightclubs were cheap, that kind of thing. It was dead easy to be able to afford gaming, really. And I'm not saying that I can't do it now. Obviously, I must do for the podcast and for my own, wants and desires. But it definitely, when you've got a family around you, it's something you've got to think about whether or not it's okay to do. So I definitely feel like there was a good time around then. Also, I feel like there's a discussion to be had. It's not just about, I guess, your age, but goes back to episode 7 when we had Nathan on the podcast and we were talking about what makes a good gamer. It doesn't matter how good you are at gaming, at what age you're a good gamer. I mean, I know, for example, on the upcoming free play games that we've got coming up, I've been playing recently, that is from an era when I don't think that I would have been any good at it when I was younger, but now I'm probably good enough to play it. But even then, I find it quite hard. It's one of those things where there are games where I could only complete them now because I've got the critical thinking process that I probably wouldn't have had when I was, say, 8 to 10 years old when I had a PlayStation 1. It's all to do with different things. Is it a good age now to be a younger gamer because games are maybe a bit more accessible? Like, for example, Nintendo games feel a bit more accessible than they used to for kids. Like, you would, I guess in the 90s, Nintendo kids would say, oh yeah, I used to love, for example, Tetris, I don't know, playing on a Game Boy or whatever, but, are they not, is it not better to play Tetris Effect now? Like, a game's not a bit easier and more accessible for people at a younger age now than there will have been? I don't know. I mean, that's probably a discussion around our eras and things and gaming eras, but yeah, there's no perfect answer to this question, like you said, Rich. I think that, it's all about when it's good for you and best for you. I think the best thing about gaming is stress relief, gaining a social community, whether that's with friends that, me and you doing this, whether it is friends listening to this, whether it is people playing games together on the couch, whether it's people playing online. When you get the most access to that, that's probably when you get the most from gaming. Personally, that's what I've got from my experience and what I hear from most people's experiences. So therefore, I think the best time in your life is maybe when that happens the most. When you get the most laughter, when it's really accessible to you as well. Gaming's one of those weird things that whilst people who even say they're not a gamer, and I'll bring Sally, my wife, up in this, and she'll say that she's not a gamer, but I know for a fact that she knows quite a lot about Mario Kart, and she really enjoys that game specifically, and I've spoke about that before. And she's probably the best she's ever been at it now, when all the additional DLC tracks are out and the Switch is really accessible. I think that, I do think that there are different times in your life where it changes how much you enjoy gaming and what the best age is. But if you were going to draw me on an answer, I feel like those late teen years, like you said, were probably really, really good to me, and I have a real appreciation of that. So it was just when we're thinking about the Burnout games and the Need for Speed, and certainly for me, the Underground 2 was sort of when I was 14, 15, that was when I played the most. I remember just really being happy with my gaming life at that time. It was just a question I thought I'd bring up. But thanks for listening this week, guys. I know it's been a bit of a different and difficult, obviously, for us going to and fro, but hopefully it's been enjoyable anyway. We will resume normal sort of service within a couple of weeks' time, but hopefully Rich will be feeling better and I won't be getting bitten by creatures of the night. Hopefully I don't get sepsis from this bite. Anyway, so thank you all very much for listening, and we appreciate your time, and we will speak to you all very soon. Alright, bye.